My name is Carolyn Strange, and in my capacity as the head of the School of History at ANU, I welcome you to the 19th Annual Allan Martin Lecture. Before I proceed, I would like to acknowledge that this event is held on the traditional lands of the Ngunnawal and Ngambri peoples. I pay my respects to their elders past, present, and emerging, and I pay respects to any Aboriginal people who are here this evening. Our speaker is Professor Sheila Fitzpatrick, a world-leading historian of Soviet Russia and a public intellectual. Her nomination befits the intention behind the bequest that funds this series and the person in whose name it was established. Allan William Martin was the first person to graduate with a PhD in history from the Australian National University in 1955. Having completed his undergraduate degree at the University of Sydney. After teaching at the University of New South Wales, Melbourne, and Adelaide, he took up the foundation chair of history at La Trobe University in 1966. He returned to ANU in 1973 as a senior fellow, remaining in that position until 1992. Under Allan Martin, the La Trobe History Department blossomed into a world-class institution, influenced by his commitment to cross-fertilize the discipline of history through the insights and methods of political science, law, and sociology, the latter most developed through his marriage to his first wife, sociologist Jean Martin. His own scholarship deepened understandings of Australian political history and advanced the craft of biography in Australia. With co-author Peter Loveday, his 1966 monograph, Parliament, Factions and Parties, the First 30 Years of Responsible Government in New South Wales, 1856 to 1889, set a high benchmark for the interpretation of colonial politics. The emergence of the Australian party system, a major collection Martin co-edited in 1977 with Loveday and Eric Fry, was the first substantial account of its subject and remains so today. After his return to ANU, Allan Martin published two landmark biographies of Henry Parkes in 1980 and of Robert Menzies, 2 volumes in 1993 and 1999. However, Professor Martin was also renowned for his warmth and generosity toward colleagues and his mentorship of higher degree research students at ANU, whom he often hosted at his home. After the death of his first wife, he remarried in 1983 to Professor Beryl Rawson, an eminent social historian of classical Rome. A prominent figure in the humanities at ANU and a leader of the disciplines of classics and history in Australia, Rawson was widowed in 2002 when Allan Martin died at the age of 76. The bequest she established in her late husband's memory has allowed the School of History to bring an impressive array of prominent Australian and overseas historians to ANU. Starting with Inge Clendenin in 2004, our former speakers include Rhys Isaac, Marilyn Lake, Tony Ballantyne, Annette Gordon-Reed, David Armitage, and Anne Curthoys, who have honored Allan Martin's memory by delivering a public lecture, providing workshops for HDR students, and meeting one-on-one with them, as well as engaging with members of the Canberra public. Through these forms of engagement, over Allan Martin Week, nominees enliven the study of history at ANU and model the qualities Martin epitomized. We are delighted that this year's Allan Martin lecturer is a scholar who exemplifies and inspires that spirit of intellectual generosity. Professor Sheila Fitzpatrick is currently Professor of History at the Australian Catholic University and Honorary Professor of History at the University of Sydney. Her career in history began with a BA earned from the University of Melbourne, followed by her PhD, awarded by St. Antony's College, Oxford, in 1969. She remained in England for a further 3 years as a research fellow at the London School of Slavonic and East European Studies. She spent the bulk of her career teaching Soviet history at the University of Chicago, where she was Bernadette Everly Schmidt Distinguished Service Professor and is now recognized as an emerita professor there. In addition to her contribution to teaching in her field, she has served and led the profession in significant ways. As president of the American Association for the Advancement of Slavic Studies and the American Association for Slavic and Eastern European Studies. She also co-edited the Journal of Modern History from 1996 to 2006. In 2012, the year she returned to Australia, the American Historical Association recognized Professor Fitzpatrick with its highest honor, the Award for Scholarly Distinction. As the author, co-author, and editor of 25 books, our speaker has received prestigious awards. She won the 2012 McGarry Medal for Biography for her memoir, My Father's Daughter, Memories of an Australian Childhood. And in 2016, she was a joint recipient of the Prime Minister's Prize for Nonfiction for her book On Stalin's Team, The Years of Living Dangerously in Soviet Politics. That work explored the lives of Joseph Stalin and his Politburo from the late 1920s to the 1950s. Although these men were closest to Stalin at the top of Soviet politics, the team had been overlooked by modern historians. In recent years, the history of immigration to Australia, particularly the experience of peoples displaced after the Second World War, has been the focus of Professor Fitzpatrick's work, which she pursues through her affiliation with the ACU's Research Center for Refugees, Migration, and Humanitarian Studies. However, tonight's topic returns to the subject of her latest book, The Shortest History of the Soviet Union, published by Black Ink just a month ago. So please join me now in welcoming Professor Sheila Fitzpatrick, this year's Allan Martin Lecture, to the podium to deliver her talk, The Soviet Union in Retrospect, Life and Death of a Superpower. Sheila.
I'm going to start actually by saying something about Allan Martin, because I actually knew him, and I was a tutor at the University of Melbourne. This is early 60s when he was lecturing there. And basically, he didn't lecture in my subject. My subject was Modern History B. But he gave one lecture per year in that subject for Alan McBride. And probably nobody but me remembers what it was. It was on the Russian Revolution. And it was a marvelous lecture. It's completely outside his normal sort of range of concerns. But he started off with Trotsky, and I can still remember sitting in that lecture room hearing him, the quotation from Trotsky that says, "History has shaken us out of her sleeve and scattered us over a vast and featureless plain." That was the beginning of his Russian Revolution lecture. So to turn to my own, not Russian Revolution, but the Soviet Union in retrospect, Life and Death of a Superpower, when I first planned this talk, it was in the middle of last year when I was finishing up The Shortest History of the Soviet Union, which, as Carolyn said, just came out. My subtitle then was, of course, Life and Death of a Superpower, but perhaps now, in light of Russia's war with Ukraine, we need to rephrase it as Life, Death, and Hopes of Resurrection of a Superpower. There's no avoiding Ukraine in a talk on the history of the Soviet Union given in 2022. And I don't even want to, because one of the things writing that shortest history made me do was think seriously about the Soviet Union's republics, regions, and nationalities, which those of you who know my work a bit will know was not at the forefront of my concerns earlier. Putin has blamed Lenin and the 1924 Constitution of the USSR for allowing republics, for example, Ukraine, to secede, and thereby setting the stage for the breakup of the Soviet Union in 1991. Of course, a bit of a stretch, but nevertheless. I won't go all the way with Putin, but I do agree with him that it's hard to make sense of what is happening now, as well as what happened in 1990 and 91, without a dose of history. However, I'm not going to let Ukraine completely take over. The Soviet regime's lifespan of roughly 70 years was the same that the Bible allows a person, and in it we can discern birth, childhood, difficult adolescence, middle age, and old age, and finally death. And as has been pointed out with regard to individual biography, it's death that suddenly imparts to an individual's life a discernible pattern, and thereby a meaning. Obituaries are always interesting reading. I found it interesting indeed to write the Soviet Union's obituary in the shortest history. Now, in this talk, I'm going to address a bunch of different topics. I've basically done it thematically, despite talking about birth, death, etc. I've done it thematically, and I'll start off by discussing the question of was the Soviet Union socialist? Then I'll go on to the question of was it an empire? After that, we have was it bound to collapse? How did that collapse happen? And finally, what the collapse meant for post-Soviet Russia, and something about Ukraine. So, was the Soviet Union socialist? This, of course, depends on what you mean by socialism. The Bolsheviks, in my understanding, meant by socialism primarily state-directed modernization, that is, economic, social, and cultural modernization, to bring Russia out of its historic backwardness being a trope with which they were very much concerned, especially in the pre-war decades. There were communalistic, egalitarian notes too. The Soviets come under that heading, the economic policies directed at equalization of economic situation, but they were less to the fore. It was the modernization encompassing collectivization of agriculture, the introduction of planned economy with the first 5-year plans that dominated the Stalin period. And this objective, though not necessarily well, we can't tell whether Lenin would have used the same extremes of coercion, but the objective was also Lenin's, despite what was described as the retreat of the new economic policy in the 1920s, which was a partial return to market economy after basically the failure of the war communism policies of extreme nationalization. As the Bolsheviks were revolutionaries, they also understood socialism as something achieved by revolutionary means, including and indeed necessarily class terror against the bourgeoisie, against the old nobility, against the prosperous peasants called kulaks, and against the clergy. Lenin both endorsed and, to a degree, tried to put the brake on that class terror. Stalin exploited it as a mobilization device. When we talk about terror, there's generally, we look from the perspective of the population as a whole and think who would want it. But if you think more narrowly in terms of a revolutionary party, the Bolshevik Party, terror is actually one of the more popular kinds of policies within the party. In other words, it gives the sense that you're actually getting somewhere, you're getting rid of the enemies. So Stalin's exploitation left its mark on on his own period, but also the subsequent one. Now, the 1930s, which is the period of the rapid industrialization, as well as the great purges at the end of the decade, the 1930s was described as the period of the building of socialism. And that really means the establishment of a planned economy, and above all, the building of a great amount of steel mills, coal mills, hydroelectric plants, the building up of economic infrastructure with a defense component, but not only. And building up not only in the historic industrial centers of the Soviet Union, Leningrad, Moscow, and Ukraine, but also further east, where there had been little industrial development before. Now, Khrushchev, in the period 1957-64, oversaw rapid economic growth and rise in living standards. It was his boast that the Soviet Union was catching up with America. And he also very rashly promised full communism, the next step after socialism, which was being built, unquote, in the 30s, full communism by 1980. And full communism meant that there would be an abundance of goods, but that they would be available communally rather than individually. In other words, through communal facilities, but not with the shortages that people associated with that, but with an abundance. Now, full communism never arrived. 1980 arrived, but not full communism. But that was, I think, okay, because the Soviet public didn't want it anyway. They were not interested in the communal distribution of goods. They were interested in the abundance part, preferably going to individuals or, at any rate, family units. Brezhnev, Khrushchev's successor, 1964 to 82 in power, with him we got what he called developed socialism. That's also called real or really existing socialism. Really existing socialism is such a clumsy locution that I've always thought it had to be German. And indeed, it has a German variant, but it appears to have been, somebody may correct me in the question period, but it appears to have been an English phrase built upon German, an English and Russian phrase built upon German models. The Russians also call it real socialism as well as developed socialism. So, what are the characteristics of this really existing socialism as to opposed to any kind of ideal of socialism? First of all, you have one-party rule, the Communist Party, of course. You have state control of the economy. You have economic planning with the 5-year plans. Now, private enterprise is only quasi-legal at a very low level, although in practice widely existing in the so-called second economy, which is on the sort of fringes of legality. Really existing socialism meant also a welfare state, a fairly poor welfare state, but not as poor as it had been in the Stalin period, and with better provision of services. A fairly egalitarian social structure. Now, of course, it was not fully egalitarian, and a lot was made in the West about how they pretended that it was an egalitarian society, but it really wasn't. Well, of course, it was not an egalitarian society. The bosses got more, but the differential was actually less than in the West, so that it was, as I say, fairly egalitarian. A characteristic of really existing socialism under Brezhnev was a workplace-based sense of community. Your workplace mattered a lot in the Soviet Union. It was both a social center and a center for the provision of goods, the supply of goods. It was a place where you might be able to get things that were otherwise not available, as well as, of course, a workplace, a place where you worked. And I think its importance to the lives, the lives of individual members of the population was evident by the fact that that come the difficult years of perestroika and just after, when often you were essentially not getting paid at the workplace, people tended to go in there anyway, partly hoping that some goods would come through, but partly, I think, because this was a real community. Also being delivered, legally at least, under the heading of really existing socialism, was equal rights for women. Now, I say legally. The legislation on women's emancipation was very fine, and it had been brought in very quickly on the Bolsheviks taking power. Now, and the other thing that they did with great effect was bringing women into the workforce from the late 1920s, so that a very high percentage of women were in the workforce by the Brezhnev period. Now, in terms of bringing women into leading positions, it was much less successful, and one reason for that is that if you are to rise in any institution, a government or party or whatever, to rise in that institution, you had to join the Communist Party, and if you joined the Communist Party, you were expected to go to meetings. Now, if you were a woman holding down a job with a family, and with conventionally in Soviet Union, you doing all the housework, you didn't want to go to a meeting once a week in the evening. And I think that apparently trivial practical reason needs to be taken into account when we think of what really existing socialism meant for women in practice. Now, in terms of rights for different nationalities, a multinational state, of course, and the republics that made up the Soviet Union, I'll talk about that more in a minute, these were nationality-based, so you had a titular nationality which was Russian or Ukrainian or Georgian or Armenian or whatever it might be. And these territories were, specific territories were allocated to those nationalities with administrative rights within them. Another characteristic of really existing socialism was education, highly valued. It's also the main means of upward mobility, free and accessible to all. On the cultural front, you had a lot of pushing of high culture, a prudish approach to popular culture, and a worry about Western modernism, viewed as probably decadent, corrupting this high culture. A low tolerance for public dissent, security police, with surveillance, we're talking Brezhnev period now, considerable surveillance, though not as heavy surveillance as, for example, in the German Democratic Republic, but still quite heavy, but compared to the Stalin period, much less terror. And finally, and I think very important for understanding how the Soviet Union, even under Brezhnev, operated and the constraints upon it, you had borders that were semi-closed. You could not come and go easily into or out of the Soviet Union. So to sum up, this really existing socialism by the Brezhnev period, one could describe it as stable, safe, but boring. And one could also add the, I think, important factors that in this period, and in fact since the Second World War, the Soviet Union was recognized as one of two superpowers. In the Brezhnev period, it had achieved, finally, military parity with the United States, but of course it had not achieved the economic parity that Khrushchev had promised, and especially with regard to consumers. So I'll turn now to the second question, was the Soviet Union an empire? In immediate retrospect, yes. The moment it collapsed, the moment that state, the Soviet Union, collapsed, everyone started calling it an empire, which they had actually not mainly been doing before. And the reason, I think, was, what else could it be if the national republics in a multinational state repudiated the central power and walked out? But just bear in mind that there are a few complications surrounding that concept of the Soviet Union as an empire. The Marxist definition of an empire, which is quite widely used, I think, more broadly, is one in which the metropolis, the center, Moscow in this case, is economically exploiting the peripheries, the colonies, and in the case of the Soviet Union, the non-Russian republics. Now, by the time we get to the flow of resources between metropolis and provinces varies throughout the Soviet period, but by the time we get to the Khrushchev and Brezhnev period, the post-Stalin period, I think it's not at all clear that the metropolis was getting more resources from the provinces and the republics than it put out to them. It's a difficult calculation to make, and economists have been wary of doing it, but on the whole, their consensus appears to be that that it wasn't operating in that in the kind of economic exploitative way that one would expect of an empire. Now, the second complication regarding the picture of the Soviet Union as an empire that fell apart is that if you think about empires falling apart, you would basically assume that the liberation of the peripheries arises out of popular sentiment and revolt against the metropolis. And that's only partly so in relation to the actual breakup of the Soviet Union. It is true for the Baltic states, which were one of the last to be incorporated, basically after the Second World War, didn't accept their incorporation into the Soviet Union, and as soon as perestroika came along, were basically headed for the exit, and that was a matter of the leaders heading for the exit, the leaders of the Baltic republics, but with a popular opinion, a vocal popular opinion behind them. To a degree, that was also true in Georgia, but elsewhere it wasn't so true. Elsewhere, the main separatist impulses are coming not from popular unrest in 1990 and beginning of 1991, but from the leaders of the republics who see a weakening central power and think about the possibility of taking their republics out of the Soviet Union, in which case they would become head of sovereign nations. And indeed, complicating the picture of imperial breakup further is the fact that the final collapse of the Soviet Union that occurred in December 1991 was led by the Russian Republic. Russian, Ukrainian, with Ukrainian and Belarusian going along with them, led by the Russian Republic, in other words, Moscow against Moscow, which is not quite what you would expect to happen. Now, I'll just give a bit of background on the whole question of nationality in the Soviet Union. To start off with, now we go back to 1917, or indeed before 1917, the Bolshevik leaders were a mixture of nationalities, with some Russians, but by no means predominant. A lot of Jews, quite a lot of Georgians, and others from the Caucasus. Basically, a broad range of nationalities. They would have been very surprised to see in the future of their party a suggestion that they represented anything Russian, because the attitude of the non-Russian nationalities when these revolutionary parties were forming towards Russian patriotism was very negative. The creation, in the wake of the Russian Revolution, which of course was not only Russian but was followed by uprisings in a number of non-Russian cities, the outcome in the early 1920s was the creation of a union of socialist nationality-based republics. The emblem was the hammer and sickle, and the motto was written in Russian, Ukrainian, Belarusian, Georgian, Armenian, and Azeri, the Azerbaijan language. Proletarians of the world, unite. Now, those four that I mentioned were the Russia, Ukraine, and Belarus, and the three Caucasian republics. Those were the first constituent blocks. Initially, the Caucasian republics were they were all together rather than separately. That's Georgia, Armenia, and Azerbaijan. Now, so the republics have a titular nationality, like Georgians, but it's important to remember that that the principle of nationalities having their own claim on territory was also applied at a lower level. In other words, within a Russian republic, a Ukrainian republic, a Georgian republic, there would be groups that were not of that dominant nationality, and where they were clustered geographically, then they would be given the right to administer so-called autonomous regions. That meant, apart from anything else, that meant that within, let's say, Georgia, you would have a bunch of non-Georgian administrative regions, like Abkhazia, and those regions would tend to fear oppression from Georgia, from Tbilisi, the capital of Georgia, and look to Moscow to play off against the Republican capital. That was a standard part of the Soviet political process. And if we want to understand what happened after the collapse of the Soviet Union, it's important to remember. Now, to outsiders, the new Soviet Union looked like a successor state. Well, it was a successor state to the old Russian Empire, but it looked like a continuation of it too, in that the borders were relatively similar. The Bolsheviks, on the other hand, saw this completely differently. They saw themselves as anti-imperialist and with a Marxist internationalist ideology, but also a belief that nationalism is sufficiently strong that you can't fight it, and therefore you have to make concessions to it, hence these nationality-based republics. The kind and the policy of so-called korenizatsiya, of indigenization, the introduction of the national language in administration and in the schools, the policies introduced in the 20s. An exception to this was Russian nationalism. The Bolsheviks were very wary about anything, about encouraging any kind of Russian nationalism. Even a kind of formal folklore-based Russian nationalism. They described that as the greatest danger. It was, in other words, a greater danger than presented by the non-Russian nationalisms. If they hadn't had that attitude, by the way, those Russian minorities in the Donbass that we now know a lot about, because that's where Putin is fighting now. If it hadn't been for that, they would have been autonomous Russian regions within Ukraine. But because the Bolsheviks were so suspicious of the potential of Russian nationalism, the Russians were not allowed to have autonomous regions within other republics. Now that's the 1920s. As we go on, the indigenization and also the affirmative action, there were strong affirmative action programs in the 1920s for particularly not so much for a nationality like Ukrainian or Georgian, which was considered developed, but those like Uzbek or other Central Asians. You have the deportations of non-Russian nationalities going, of course, completely against the kind of sympathetic policy originally laid down. In the Stalin period, then you have the anti-Semitic campaign, also completely against party traditions in the late 1940s, early 50s, at the very end of the Stalin period. Then, with Stalin's death, there was a move away from repression of non-Russian nationalities, led, by the way, by the Lavrentiy Beria, the security police chief who didn't last very long before being executed by his comrades. But they continued that policy which he had introduced. Now, if we go a bit further into the Brezhnev period, and by the 70s and 80s, they started to talk about the emergence of a Soviet, something like a Soviet nationality, as distinct from all these Russian, Ukrainian, Armenian, etc. nationalities making up the Soviet Union. They were not talking about forcing people to become Soviet, to stop being Armenian or whatever and become Soviet, but rather as a natural process that they hope to see developing. Now, actually, the intermarriage statistics, the statistics of marriage between nationalities, indicates that their hopes were a bit optimistic, in that basically they were surprisingly low, given that officially marriage between people of different Soviet nationalities was not just completely fine, it was regarded as a good thing. Culturally, in the case of many nationalities, it wasn't regarded as a good thing, and it was not widely practiced, with the exception of nationalities that felt themselves to be close, like Russian, Ukrainian, Belarusian. There you did have it. In terms of the relative standing of different nationalities, under Stalin, the Georgians did really well. They didn't do so well after Stalin, and that was a ground for dissatisfaction. It was actually the Ukrainians who did well under Khrushchev and still again under Brezhnev. And I mean by doing well that not only were they like the other republics by this time conventionally always led by a person of that nationality, a Moscow appointee, but somebody, Ukraine led by Ukrainians, etc. But also the Ukrainian representation in the Politburo was quite strong, and the Politburo was where the significant political decisions were made. Now on to the question of, was the Soviet Union bound to collapse? Now, this whole question of historical inevitability was an interesting one for me, writing the shortest history, because the Bolsheviks, as Marxists, they believed that they had mastered the laws of history, which tell you, for example, that capitalism is bound to collapse and be succeeded by socialism. And in general, they felt that if you understood things well enough, it was therefore to a degree possible to predict in history. Now, I don't share that view. I would see chaos theory as much more relevant to understanding such questions. In other words, I think contingency matters. And I think that both the birth of the Soviet Union and its death illustrate very, very strongly the power of contingency. You had, in both cases, extremely little prediction that this was a likely outcome, even quite close to the event. And of course, one response to that is to say, well, everybody making the predictions, everybody in that business was wrong, but the other way, the other view of it might be that indeed contingency played a huge part. Now, in trying to make that point about the Soviet Union, and in particular about its collapse, I decided that I'd start the shortest history in an unusual way. I started in 1980. And the reason I started in 1980 is that was a period, it was the height of the boring but stable Brezhnev period, when living standards were up, housing shortage ameliorated, no wars or internal revolts. Well, they were just going into Afghanistan, but we'll count that out for the moment, because those problems arising from that hadn't yet become visible. So a superpower with military parity. Of course, there were problems. A decline in the rate of economic growth, unwieldy bureaucracy, not wanting to reform itself, periodic outbursts of discontent with Soviet tutelage in Eastern Europe, difficulties with the US and détente, and then the Soviet Union itself, the emergence of a dissident movement, much remarked in the West, but less important, probably looked at domestically. And then, as I said, Afghanistan is going to be a problem where they have just gone into. But if you were a Soviet leader looking at the world in 1980, and in particular the US, I think there was the tendency to think, thank God we don't have their problems. Looking back over the 70s, we don't have race problems like that. We don't have youth estrangement that bad. We don't have a drug problem of significance. We are doing fine. And indeed, even looking from the perspective of the United States, in 1980, the Soviet Union had never looked so stable. This is the year when the political scientists basically all said, let's stop pretending that the Soviet Union is on the brink of collapse, as we've been doing for 60 years or whatever. Let's admit that it is here, it's here to stay. There were a series of statements like this, and there was no significant dissent in the American political science community about that. And as a trivial thing, but I feel a telling incident, or little vignette, the Library of Congress, which is the main library of record for the United States, then used card catalogs. The older people will remember card catalogs, you know, before everything was online. Anyway, there was no card that said the Soviet Union. Why was there no card for the Soviet Union? Because basically of emigre protests. There were quite a lot of emigres working early on in the Library of Congress, and they did not want to recognize the existence of Russia. This is back in the 20s. They didn't want to recognize the existence of the Soviet Union. And so in the Library of Congress, when I started work, and indeed up to the early 80s, you wanted to look up something about the Soviet Union, you went to a card called Russia, 1923 on. And that was the Soviet Union. So the new historian, the new librarian of Congress, James Billington, he happened to be a Russianist, he thought this is stupid. There's no card for the Soviet Union. We have to accept realities. And so he wrote around to the profession saying, does everybody agree that it is stupid to pretend that the Soviet Union isn't there, you know, as a permanent feature of the landscape and should have a card in our card catalog? And everyone said yes. It seemed obvious. And so by the time they had, I think, 11 years of making cards for the Soviet Union, and then there was no need anymore. So how did it happen, the collapse? I see I've got to be quite quick about this. It happened, in my view, because of Gorbachev's perestroika in the second half of the 80s. It's a reform movement which goes wrong. And here I think one can turn to de Tocqueville and his comment apropos of the French Revolution, that there is no more dangerous time for a regime than when it tries to reform. And I think this illustrates that is indeed the case. Now, Gorbachev was not introducing a reform program in the face of crisis. He described it as a pre-crisis situation, but that was probably that was an exaggeration. The economic downturn came after the introduction of perestroika rather than before. But Gorbachev's conviction was that reform, they needed both political reform with more openness, with more discussion, more involvement of more democracy basically, and economic reform to get out of the sort of sclerotic economic bureaucracy which was basically intrinsically hostile to innovation. Now, this was the same problem that the Chinese were facing at the same time, and they made quite different decisions. Gorbachev decided to start with political reform, with democracy, with openness, with discussion, and then go on to economic reform. I think partly because he didn't know what kind of economic reform would be appropriate, and hoped that discussion would make this clear. The trouble was that introducing this widespread discussion, taking off the censorship about discussion not only of current ills, but also of past ones, that had the effect of, it was extremely exhilarating to be around at the time because the press was absolutely fascinating to read. It was just one expose after the other, historical and current. But for Soviet citizens, ordinary Soviet citizens, it was quite demoralizing because people who had a sort of vague sense we're doing okay, we're a decent country, suddenly were presented with material that suggested to the contrary. And so it had a very dismaying effect on public opinion. There was also the question of Gorbachev moves in a way away from his Communist Party base, which was that was the inter-republican mechanism for keeping it together. Moves towards a presidential model. He is himself, initially he is the first secretary of the Communist Party and he keeps that position, but he also becomes president, but not a popularly elected president of the Soviet Union, but rather one elected by an ad hoc body. And the problem with, sorry, I've got my pages mixed up. Now, at the same time that Gorbachev had added his title of first secretary of the Communist Party, the title of president of the Soviet Union, all the heads of the republics had done the same thing. In other words, they had previously been first secretary of Ukraine or wherever it was, and now they became also president. And this happened in the Russian Republic too, which had never been a political base before, but Boris Yeltsin, a competitor of Gorbachev, made it so. And in many cases, these new Republican presidents were popularly elected, notably Yeltsin. And so when there were, by the end, there were therefore two presidents in Moscow, one popularly elected for the Russian Republic, one not popularly elected for the Soviet Union. There was not room for both of them, and it was the Russian one who won out, and as I've said before, led the other remaining republics out of the Union. Now, what the collapse meant for post-Soviet Russia, first of all, I think one has to be very clear. It meant humiliation. It meant loss of the superpower status, which was unexpected, a collapse of the Soviet Union which was not expected by the populace any more than that was expected by foreign observers, didn't seem to make sense, and was in many ways very traumatic. And the trauma included what was called the shock the economic shock of the introduction of what was called wild capitalism in the 1990s in Russia. Now, with Russians, I think, although bewildered, sort of accepted the departure of the other republics as something that it was surprising, it was disappointing, but it had happened. But then came the question about what about those non-Russian areas within the Russian Republic? Were they going to be allowed to secede too? And let's take Chechnya as the example, because that was the one that they ended up by fighting about. The Russian line, Yeltsin's line, and still more Putin's line later was, no, that's not going to happen. From within the Russian Republic, we're not going to have any departures. Hence the wars in Chechnya, which were conducted by both Yeltsin and Putin. Now, then the question of relations with the West. The fact of the collapse of the Soviet Union meant that there was a tremendous loss of status. There was a loss of superpower status, and the prospect of and because of the fact that the Eastern European countries, which had previously been satellites of the Soviet Union, had now also exited, there was the danger that that they would be drawn into the Western orbit and therefore deprive the Soviet Union of what they felt was the necessary border regions. Now, as Gorbachev and subsequently Yeltsin thought, they had an agreement that NATO would not would not take in the Eastern European countries, which it started to do, in fact, in 1999. This was a verbal agreement, but it's actually not contested by the Western accounts that there was a verbal agreement, but basically the West went back on that. So the Baltic countries and Bulgaria were taken into NATO in 2004. That was already a difficult thing for the Russians to accept. But still more difficult was going to be if any of the former Soviet republics were taken into NATO. And that's, of course, an important part of the lead up to the current war in Ukraine, because Georgia and Ukraine since 2008 have been applicants for NATO membership, and successively the statements from NATO have been were getting more and more sympathetic to that, to those applications. Now, in terms of Russian, I'm not here talking Putin, but ordinary Russians, insofar as one can never identify anybody as ordinary. But I was very struck by the fact of how many people would say to me in the 1990s and the 2000s, before the West hated us because we were communists, and then we stopped being communists, but they still hate us. Therefore, they hate us because we're Russians, which I thought was a somewhat bizarre comment, but it doesn't seem perhaps so bizarre as it seemed then. But that was certainly something that that left a big mark on them. As of 2017, Russian opinion polls found that 71% thought that the breakup of the Soviet Union had been a mistake. When you get the opinion polls of that period on particular periods, particular past leaders, the assessments are very different from our assessments. Gorbachev is way down, right at the bottom. Khrushchev's also pretty low down too. But Gorbachev is unpopular because he's the man who presided over the breakup of the Soviet Union, which people think was a bad thing and a failure and a national humiliation. The Brezhnev period, regarded at the time as very boring, started to look really good in retrospect, and the Stalin period, despite the awful incidents or episodes of repression, also started to look good because he won the war, he's the nation builder, etc. Now, all those things I've been saying about Russian attitudes apply particularly to the generations that were old enough to remember the Soviet Union. But it's now 30 years ago, and now we have we've got cohorts coming up who do not remember it at all, and I would think it quite possible that these attitudes that have been characteristic of the 30 years will wane. That all these questions and the relationship with the West will seem different. But that hasn't yet been, one can't clearly document that as of now. And I'll end up very briefly on the question of Ukraine. Now, on the possible reconstitution of the Soviet Union, Putin said, and he's been very widely quoted for saying this, anyone who feels no regret for the passing of the Soviet Union has no heart. And anybody who thinks it can be reversed has no brain. So in my last paragraph of the shortest history, I quoted that, of course, because everybody did. But I thought, well, that's not quite enough. So then I had, as it were, channeling Putin, I had a sentence that says, but who knows what the future holds? A leader with a brain, somebody perhaps like Putin, might see a way to recover some of what had been lost, even if it fell short of restoration. And then I had another sentence. And that sentence, this is written in the, I suppose it's the middle of 2020, it's my penultimate version. I said, I quoted Putin, who had just commented specifically on Ukraine in relation to this question of possible a small-scale restoration. Why, he said, should Ukraine suffer the tremendous economic losses and deindustrialization, his phrase, arising out of separation from Russia? Putin reflected in an interview in 2020 when, quote, we are the same people and together could become a global player again. Now, when it came to my final version, I looked at that. This is, of course, some months before the war, and I thought, no, historians shouldn't get too, it looks as if I'm getting into prediction, it's too specific, perhaps the next trouble is not going to be Ukraine but somewhere else, so I took it out. So it is therefore not in the Australian version. However, there's also a UK edition, and the UK publisher is a very enterprising man, and he sold out his first edition, his first printing before the official publication date, and that enabled him, for the second printing for the official publication date, to put in an extra sentence. And so he wrote to me saying, do you have a sentence? Can you add a sentence on Ukraine for your last paragraph? And of course, I felt enormously smug. I said, yes, I have my sentence that I took out of penultimate version, so I sent it back by return email, and there it is in the UK edition, but not the Australian one. But I also added another sentence with which I will end this talk, and that is, the ghost of the Soviet Union was not going to disappear as quickly as the Soviet Union itself had done. Thank you.